Another difficulty, and this is a big one, is the language within Genesis about our and us.
Oh, yes.
When referring to God.
Yeah, let's definitely get into that one.
Yeah, that's a big problem.
Which verse was that?
I think the first one that comes up is 126.
126. Let's pull that up here.
God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea," so on and so forth. I think the problem with that is quite obvious, right?
Yeah.
That probably doesn't need to be explained.
Well, explain it anyhow. Though.
Yeah, who is our?
Who is our? Right. Yeah.
Right.
Is that the Trinity? Is that what's going on?
It could be.
Is he talking to his heavenly host of angels? Other beings? Is he talking to the dinosaurs?
A divine council, maybe.
Oh, a divine council.
Yeah.
That was better than my answer.
No, it might be necessarily the same thing as the angels.
Yeah.
Which you had mentioned. In fact, the divine council, also known as the children of God, in most of the ancient texts, get translated into English as angels. So there's a lot of Hebrew and then eventually Greek texts that refer to the angels as children of God. But when we translate it into English, it gets translated as angel. So, and to be sure, the divine council that is spoken about within the Old Testament were considered children of God.
So it does talk about the divine council?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Michael Heiser has written a number of books on the subject.
I read one by him.
Yeah, he's certainly not the first person to bring it up, but I think Michael Heiser, in the current time period that we're in, is probably the most popular author to make books on the subject that were readable by normal people.
So what was this divine council then?
Well, the divine council is a common feature in ancient Near Eastern religion.
That's not good.
Where you have a head deity.
Okay. We're talking about the Trinity again?
We might refer to it as a pantheon.
Oh, pantheon of the gods, like Greek gods, right?
Or in Hebrew, maybe more accurately, henotheism, where there is one supreme God, and then all other...
Like Zeus, right?
Somewhat like Zeus, except Zeus is not clearly a supreme creator of all. He seems to be on par with a few other deities, meaning he may not be all powerful. Typically in henotheism, you have what appears to be a pantheon of gods, but there is a clear hierarchy where there is only one God within the pantheon that is to be worshipped, and he is the high deity, the God of gods.
That's what it sounds like here, right?
That tends to be the typical view that we would place in the Old Testament, is that henotheism is actually what was practiced, not monotheism.
Of course, it's the same thing if there's only one God that you're worshiping, right?
It seems to be semantic.
Yeah, because what God without lowercase g is just another name for what, angel or divine or what?
It's more nuanced than that.
Of course.
Of course, part of the problem is that there's an entire mythology about the children of God within ancient Near Eastern texts and Canaanite texts, especially from the Ugaritic text, which was a northern Canaanite city that was most likely a very popular source of both religion and mythology for the earliest Israelites. A lot of what we see in the Old Testament in terms of worshiping Baal and worshiping other deities, these were not anomalies. These were features of Canaanite religion. These were the same people that claimed to be worshipers of Elohim. And
it wasn't that long ago. Canaan, that was, since the beginning of time. I feel like they would still know about God or something, right? That made sense.
Yeah. What we find, a lot of the
so
worship,
why do they worship two of them? Maybe because, like you said, Baal?
Baal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or Baal. There's a lot of ways to pronounce it.
Is it possible that he was real?
It is possible. It's possible that the whole divine council and all the children of God are a real feature, and there's enough verses in the Old Testament that speak of it that we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we didn't take it at face value. And that's where Baal comes in. Mm-hmm. So Baal is we'll say maybe not the favored, but the highest of the children of God. Mm-hmm. Much like Jesus is considered to be the exalted Son of God, Baal would have been the exalted son of Elohim. Ooh. And so
that sounds blasphemous, right?
He wielded a high amount of power within the pantheon of deities that we know about ancient
So
Canaan.
Are we talking about Satan here? Or is this totally...
No, Baal wouldn't be considered Satan at all.
Okay. Well,
Baal would have been a very important deity within the Canaanite religion, which, to be sure, is what the religion of Israel was based on. So the northern tribes, Israel, certainly their practices and their religion were rooted in Canaanite religion. They also worshiped the deity referred to as El and or Elohim, depending on the time period, which is, why Elohim is the name for God, but is also plural, is something that we'll definitely want to get into. We there's no way we have time for it this week. We probably could dedicate a whole discussion to why the name of God is plural, and it is from a factual basis, right, not to do with the Trinity and everything to do with how the Hebrew language is formed.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in Hebrew, there's not just Hebrew. In other languages, there's concrete abstractions where you can take something, you say like a verb, and you can convert it into a noun by using plural language. And so there's lots of ways in which that shows up in the Hebrew language. One of the classic ways, and unfortunately I forget the Hebrew word, but we can do this topic more justice later.
Right.
The word for virginity and the word for a virgin. So you've taken a noun, you've now abstracted it to mean something more generalized, like virginity. Mm-hmm. You're literally just taking the word for virgin and you're making it plural, and then you're using it in a context in where we have to assume that it is a generalized abstraction of the noun virgin. So we see this quite a bit in the Semitic languages, not just in Hebrew, and the word Elohim seems to be one of those characteristics where the word for God, El, which also happens to be the name for God, just like in modern Semitic languages, like in Arabic, Allah is the name of God, but the word also just means God. In ancient Semitic languages, especially Hebrew, the word El means God, but it also was the name of the high God within the pantheon in Canaan. Mm-hmm. Elohim is an abstraction of the word El that could just mean generically referring to a divine being. Or some people would say you would convert El to Elohim, it would mean you would change the word from God to divine. And that does actually fit pretty well with a lot of how the Hebrew prose is put together. They use a lot of synonyms when they create the text because they want to say the same thing multiple times, but in different ways. So we've come full circle now with the parallelism.
You know what? I think I believe you, even if I don't really know what you're saying, but you're very convincing.
Right.
Yeah. We'll have to, I don't know, work harder on that plural,
I think we can probably dedicate a whole half hour to that because there are a lot of demonstrations within the Semitic languages and how this language feature works.
What I'd like to get into is ignoring that it's just some sort of literary thing maybe it is our, like there is, the divine council. Maybe there are other gods.
Mhm.
Now remember, God with a lowercase is different than God with a uppercase.
Right.
Lesser gods, like is Baal,
Right.
I'd like to know if he was part of their, or was he in there, he was there in the beginning, before humans. Was he an angel?
I don't know if we have answers to that.
Oh, I know, but
But it is interesting in Genesis 3:22, there's this fun thing that happens where after they've been cursed,
yeah,
it says, "And the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden."
yeah, that's weird, right?
Yeah, so the question here...
because it's saying that they actually were able to become like them. Now, probably not like God, right? So who are they becoming more like? Right.
Well, I actually think the implication here is that they have become like God in that they possess knowledge and also immortality. And that is a big problem. You can have immortality or you can have knowledge. But if you have both, you've become a god, and now you're a threat to the gods. And this is another common feature. And this gets... It's a common feature in Semitic mythology where there is, we'll say, a battle between the deities in heaven, and making sure that mankind is not able to ascend to the heavens and possibly even take over the heavens or have to fight for it. And the book of Enoch mentions something of this nature in the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
So some of the reasoning for the Tower of Babel was that just like here in Genesis, there is a generalized fear that mankind might ascend to the place of the gods. And then you've got a serious problem. And here we see the same thing, because mankind cannot be on par with the deities or be a threat to the deities.
Yeah, none of this makes sense though, right? Who's thinking that? God isn't thinking that, right? Who wrote that?
And so this is one of the reasons why I personally would classify the first 11 chapters of Genesis as mythology. Okay. Because it pairs so well with all the mythological texts from its time period. And it is in agreement in terms of geography, names, places, ideas that you find in the ancient texts. In a lot of the Old Babylonian texts, you'll find that there are human beings that go through similar things that you see in Genesis, like a flood, and someone surviving a flood, and somebody actually having possession of a part of the tree of life, and then that being taken away by a snake. These are themes that all pop up in the ancient Near Eastern literature.
I don't want to hear about this. You're testing my faith.
It's all there. These are very common themes, very common ideas. Including the idea that there are multiple deities, and that those deities have to make sure that mankind is, quote unquote, stayed within their place.
Well, let me say something. So the Israelites, Israel, their God was, of course, God, right?
The God?
The God, yes.
Like Yahweh?
Yes.
Or or Elohim? Or were they the same? Were Yahweh and Elohim the same deity?
I have literally no idea. All right, listen. But the other places, the other cities, they all had their own God, didn't they? And it wasn't the God. You know what I'm saying? So were those all just...
And so that's one of the features of henotheism that we need to talk about, is there was typically a high God. He was, the Almighty, El Elyon. But the lesser deities still had a place. Much like we would say in Catholic theology, they would pray to the saints. It's not that they worshipped necessarily the saints, as the supreme deity. It's just that they believe that the saints play a role in the heavens. They have a function or a job. So some saints, you might pray to. Classic example: when I was a kid in Catholic school, you might pray to a particular saint if you lost something. There's seems to be a saint for everything. Mm-hmm. And so you'll see similar features of that in ancient henotheism. It wasn't necessarily incompatible that you may have given homage or made a sacrifice to a lesser deity, because that deity was believed to have a particular role within the larger context of all the divine beings.
So what if, say this is true, mm-hmm. What if Baal was one of those lesser ones that initially was part of God's counsel, and much like Satan thought he was, mm-hmm. Too good for this, and decided he would be he would be God now.
Sure. So that's an interesting thing, because we have text from Ugarit, which is the major metropolitan and religious center of northern Canaan, where a lot of the theology that we know about Israelite life and worship came from. And within those texts, we know that Baal actually had to earn his position as the head deity underneath his father. And so...
The father being God, right?
El.
God.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what we see is, and this is a common feature, we see it also as, say, like with Marduk in the Babylonian religion. So that would be the Neo-Babylonian religion. Marduk had to defeat the evil sea deity to earn his spot as the highest of the children of God. Okay. Baal, somewhat similar. There's a thing called a Baal cycle, mm-hmm. That tells the story of how Baal was died and resurrected, but eventually it had overcome the battle with the help of his sister or not, overcome the battle with the sea deity Yam, who coincidentally is related to the ancient Leviathan. So the ancient Leviathan was, at least in Semitic culture, was in relation with the sea deity, which was typically characterized as bad and chaotic. And the Leviathan was often pictured as what we would say like an evil pet, or even a sidekick, mm-hmm. of the deity. And so you'll see, even in the Hebrew language, the word for the sea, especially at the beginning where the Spirit of God hovers over the waters, refers to the waters as Yam. Yam is the Ugaritic and the Hebrew name for the sea deity. And so there's a picture here of the Spirit of God subduing the chaotic sea deity, not just the waters. There's the imagery that the Yam is representation not of just the waters of chaos or the waters of the abyss, but that it wasn't Baal and it wasn't Marduk that subdued Yam. It was the Spirit of God. And so there's a little bit of what we would say in theology, some polemical language.
I don't know what that means, but you're basically saying that the writers of chapter 1, what have you, were saying that their God was subduing everybody else's gods. Right.
Yeah, the implication here is you've heard of Marduk, you've heard of Baal, you've heard of these other deities, mm-hmm. But it was God who had subdued the waters of chaos. Mm. And you'll see some of that like in the book of Job, and that's why certain parts of Genesis are really interesting, because they seem to be written in opposition to what people thought of the time period.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So we would say anti-Babylonian, mm-hmm. but at the same time uses so much Babylonian imagery and context for understanding. And that becomes really apparent when you get to the early narratives, like with Esau, Jacob, the tower, Noah, and whatnot. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of direct references to more Eastern mythological ideas.
Okay.
But here in the early part of Genesis, back what we were talking about with the plural language, is generally agreed among scholars that the plural language is an artifact of a time period where the Hebrews legitimately practiced henotheism, and there was no theological issue with referring to the gods as being multiples.
Did they practice this heno? Is that what you said?
Henotheism.
Did they practice this because there were other gods?
Well, it would seem to be that if God had children, which is what they believed,
right,
that they would also be considered gods.
Right.
So there's no mental hang-up. Is if you're giving honor to God's children, there's not necessarily a conflict there. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It'd be like if you had children and I came to visit and I gave gifts to your children. I'm honoring your children. I'm making them to be special. I'm doing something kind for them. But at the same time, anything done for your children is done for you. So I'm also honoring you in the process.
Which would be all well and good, except I'm pretty sure you weren't supposed to worship these other guys, right?
And that, to be sure, is a major aspect of later Hebrew text within the Old Testament. The exclusive worship of God, especially under the name Yahweh, does not necessarily appear in the earliest texts of the Old Testament.
Oh.
Especially because he seems to be geographically located.
Right, that's what I'm trying to tell you. That's what I was saying. Like, he's the God of Israel. Right. And there are other gods of other places,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just like Yahweh, in the earliest of times, Yahweh would have definitely been a southern deity. In fact, some people believe that Yahwism was formed right near the border between Egypt and the southern Levant, not too far from where Moses' wife came from in the Midianites. So we do have archaeological evidence from early time periods, maybe not as old as Abraham, but certainly as old as Moses. Mm-hmm. We have archaeological evidence that the name Yahweh existed in the southern Levantine region, where the Midianites would have been located, and where there would have been trade and commerce between the southern Canaanites and Egypt. So it's not till later that it seems that the worship of Yahweh is either mixed with the worship of El, or just supersedes it altogether. And that's why there's a lot of people will point out in the book of Exodus where the name Yahweh is revealed to Moses. Mm-hmm. It would seem that maybe that verse was placed there as an explanation as to why the name Yahweh at that time period where it was written for the particular audience, why the name Yahweh is used and not the name El or Elohim is used anymore. And the general idea is that your ancestors knew me as Elohim, but so my actual name is...
Now it's a more personal relationship, is that right? Is that right?
Yeah.
So God is changing.
Right.
I mean, not that he changes, but...
And there's there's a lot of modern scholars that write about this topic, like Mark Smith and a few others, where they detail the developmental changes within the Old Testament text and how those changes affect the religious practices and how the references to Elohim and the references to Yahweh tend to correlate to what we know archaeologically, the changes that were happening, within the time periods.
What do you mean?
Well, it seems that as the southern tribes began to merge, especially when Israel and Judah were united under the united monarchy. You think of David as the uniter of the monarchy there.
Yeah, right.
It would seem that the language and the archaeological finds suggest that the worship of Yahweh expanded during this time period.
Oh, okay.
But even more so as the northern tribes began to lose power, and the southern tribe, Judah and then Benjamin, were gaining power, and then even more so when the northern tribes were wiped out completely by the Akkadians. So once the Assyrians came westward and took out the northern tribes in Israel, Judah became the only superpower left in the region. And they were free to write their narratives and sort of rewrite some of Israel's narratives.
Yeah.
And this is a time period where a lot of the Old Testament texts were placed together, and then we see a lot of interweaving of texts from this time period in order to make multiple stories go together by adding interconnected bits.
So they're trying to appease the North and the South, right?
Yeah, certainly during the United Monarchy, there was an attempt to unite the two religious fronts, the worship of Yahweh and the worship of Elohim. And the passage where the name of God, Yahweh, is revealed is often believed to come from this time period where there was people trying to, as the two kingdoms were merging, trying to explain that we are not two different kingdoms worshiping two different deities. They were indeed actually the same deity.
Right.
And of course, that's once again a very large topic we can spend an entire week on.
Sounds like we can spend a week on every topic.
Just about.
Yeah.
Just about. Nevertheless, the answer is it's very complicated.
Yeah. That's the answer to every question.
If it wasn't, this would have been a 2-minute conversation. We would have been done.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't have had to go through all this.